Okay. Dear Father in heaven, we are so thankful once again to be able to come together to study, especially in the time that we're living in. And we're thankful for the way that you work in our lives as you lead and guide us. And we're also thankful for the people around us, the opportunities that we have to share your message with others. And we invite your Spirit now as we study and open your word together. We ask, Lord, that your Holy Spirit can unite us and that we can understand the message that we're going to give not just to the Levites, but to the world. Help us to understand our role and our part, and to take whatever tasks that you give us to do them faithfully. And we ask again for your Spirit and your teaching and your guidance. And in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay, well, welcome back, everyone. And so this will probably be the last one on the two sticks. So I'm going to try to review to some degree and come to a conclusion. A lot of the details that I could do in this presentation are actually going to be done on Sundays, dealing with the structure of prophetic chronology. But I'm going to address the basic ideas of the joining of the two sticks, both in Millerite history and our line, but I'm not going to go into detail in this study as I would on the study on Sunday. So I'm going to leave a lot of the details for that study. So to review, we know that the joining of the two sticks and the separation of the two sticks happens at different times in history. So I'm going to draw this out. So we know we have here in the story of Joseph, because we have Judah who sells Joseph into slavery, and 22 years later, they're going to be joined. So here they're separated, and here Judah and Joseph are going to be joined. So they're going to be joined together. And we dealt with that line, and this becomes the law of first mention applies here. So we know that in Ezekiel, it's going to address this prophecy regarding the joining of the two sticks. And we, of course, know that those two tribes, or the two nations, are really being talked about. And that's because though Judah and Joseph join here, what we see then after the rise of ancient Israel in 977, we're going to have a revolution. And this revolution here is going to cause the separation. So this is going to be the separation I can never remember. Separation of the two sticks. That is, we're going to have Judah, which is going to be the southern kingdom, and Ephraim, which is going to be the northern kingdom. So you got the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom, and this is where this separation occurs. Now, we also dealt with the idea that there's these two lines where we stretch, because we know Ephraim, the capital there is Samaria, and the capital of Judah is Jerusalem. And it's in, can't remember the verse, 2 Kings, I think it's 21, but that's where it talks about, I'll stretch the line of Samaria over the line of Jerusalem. So this is the line of Jerusalem, this is the line of Samaria. And the line of Jerusalem They have their own 2520 that starts in 677, and this starts in 723. So the line of Samaria is stretched over top of the line of Jerusalem. Now, of course, this separation happens here, but we also have another civil war, and this civil war starts in 723. So this is a civil war. Now, of course, we could call this a civil war as well. The reason why I use this revolution and civil war is I'm comparing this to American history.
You're not being 742?
Yeah, pardon me, 742. Yeah. So we have this revolution here that's part of American history and a civil war that we can then parallel this history to. And I've done that in other studies, and I don't think I'm going to deal with that study in detail. But we know that in American history, there is a revolution, and that doesn't cause a separation from within America. It causes a separation from England, and then they have this civil war amongst themselves. So there are some differences here, but we can definitely see that this would parallel American history, a revolution and a civil war. And this is a period of 235 years that this occurs. And then from this civil war, we're going to have a period of 235 months until 723. And this is going to be the end of the North. So the North is typifying, and I don't know the best way to do this because I've never really presented this, but the North is typifying the United States because it's the false prophet. And Jerusalem is typifying Seventh-day Adventists because we're Judah. We got apostate Protestantism, and we have true worship. So God's denominated people in our history. And so we're going to look at that. So we see this revolution and this civil war. We see the separation of these two sticks. But where they become joined is when you stretch the line of Samaria over the line of Jerusalem. That is, these lines are lines of separation. Samaria has its scattering, and Jerusalem is going to have its scattering later. But where they're going to join is in our history. So we know that here we're going to have 1798, and we're going to have 1844. And this is what we're going to look at here, is we're going to look at this period from 1798 to 1844 and understand how this relates to the joining of the two sticks. So when we go over here, I'm just going to put it here, we got 1798. So this period of 20 years is a period of where the North is scattered, but it's going to be gathered here. And this is a two-horn power. So we can go all the way back here to 977, and we know that when this revolution occurred, that northern Israel put two calves for worship. One was in Dan, and one was in Bethel. And Dan and Bethel, Dan is a judge, means judge, and Bethel means the house of God. So this is the house of God. And so these symbolize the state, and this symbolizes the church. So we can see church and state is here in 977. And we've dealt with the prophecies of Ezekiel and how they connect 977 with the midnight cry message in other studies. So I'm not going to go into that, but we know that the symbol here is the 15th day of the 8th month, where Jeroboam is offering on the altar in Bethel. And there's symbols there of the midnight cry. One is this date is mentioned twice, and the prophet says, "O altar, altar," and he gives his prophecy of Josiah. So we have these symbols that represent midnight and the midnight cry, and this period here, there's 235 years in these 235 months. And when I say 235 months, because that's a metonic cycle of 19 years. So in a period on the biblical calendar, every 19 years, your calendar is going to repeat, and you're going to have 235 months repeating. Now with the rabbinic calendar, they have that cycle set so that every day is marked. Obviously, if you're using observing the calendar, observing the sky, it's going to be a little bit different every 19 years, but you still will have 235 months in a period of 19 years. And that is an interesting symbol in and of itself, because what there is there's 19 years, 12 of the years are normal years that have no leap month, and then 7 of the years are going to have a leap. So if you had just taken 12 times 19, you would have 228 months, because 12 times 19 is 228. But because we have 7 extra months added in that period of 19 years, it ends up being 235 months. But this number 12 and 17 here being together, they become an important symbol, because this is the number of the week and this is the number of the covenant, and they showed up in our structure of the 1260 or 2604 years from the beginning of the prophetic year to the end of it. So when I look at these 19 years here, they become more of a symbol in and of itself, that they symbol the prophetic year, symbolize it. And that's not something that's going to be readily evident to most people. Now, we also have this 2520 that results, and we know then in 723 that this is going to be the end of the northern kingdom, beginning with the captivity of Hoshea in 723, and finally the destruction of Samaria in 721. So here in this history, when the United States is rising, the United States is the gathering of this nation of northern Israel. So when you have northern Israel, the north is the false prophet. And when we have the United States rise here, it is also the false prophet. So in 1798, we're going to have the end of the 2520 for northern Israel, but it's not going to be literally Jews. It's going to be Protestants, because they're the Gentiles. They're the nations, and they were scattered into the nations. And so when God gathers his people from the nations, they're not going to be literal Jews. They're not going to be literal Israel. They're going to be a type of spiritual Israel. Now, we also know that when in 1844, God is going to begin gathering Seventh-day Adventists, this is going to be Judah. This is the church. This is God's denominated people that's going to be gathered from 1844. And we know that Protestants have their opportunity here. And that's what we're going to be looking at. And I'm still not sure how to present it, how much detail I can provide in doing this. But we're going to be looking at the first, second, and third angels' messages. And we're going to be looking at, so Revelation 14 and Revelation 18. It's sort of the way I decided to approach it. Okay. So, of course, we're all familiar with the three angels' messages. And, as Seventh-day Adventists, when we look at these passages, we tend to look at chapters in the Bible often separate. We don't really think about their connection with what's happened before. So Revelation 14, in order to understand these three angels' messages, you need to read Revelation 13. right? Because we know that this is marking 1798. But, in order to understand Revelation 13, you need to understand Revelation 12. In order to understand Revelation 12 properly, you need to understand Revelation 11. But, we're not going to go all the way back there. We're just going to go to Revelation 13. And we talked about this yesterday in the study of prophetic chronology. And what we have in Revelation 13 is we have these two different beasts, which we're familiar with, but it's the timing of where we are. So we know that we have, in Revelation 12, we have a great red dragon that has 7 heads and 10 horns. Okay, I'm gonna go back there, and we dealt with this, at least mostly with the woman part of it. But the thing that you want to notice when you're looking at these beasts, because we have one in Revelation 12, we have one in Revelation 13, and another one in Revelation 17, that people often don't make a distinction between. That is, they just see this beast with 7 heads and 10 horns, and they just think it's the same beast, it's the same power. And it's not. And it's also not the same time period. They are related, obviously, because the symbols are very similar, but they're telling us something different. So we know when we study Revelation 12, the context is pagan Rome. Now, the dragon primarily represents Satan, but it's also pagan Rome. Ellen White tells us this. And when we look at this dragon, it says in verse 3, "And there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his heads." So this is the only detail I want to look at here. So when we look at this dragon, or this beast, it has 7 heads and 10 horns, but this one has crowns upon its heads. So this is different from the other ones. When we go to Revelation 13, and we look at this next beast, it says in verse 1, "And I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his 10 horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the names of blasphemy." So when we look at this, we see a difference. And I don't know if you notice it. Does anybody notice the difference between these two?
The crown is on the horns rather than the head.
Right. So one has 10 crowns. The other has 7 crowns. The one with the 10 crowns, those crowns are upon its horns. With the other one, the 7 crowns are upon the heads. And there's different ways that people have tried to understand this. Most people just don't notice it. When you look at the pioneers' writings, and when you look at the 1843 chart, the way that they understood this was referring to, and if you look at the chart, it'll say pagan Rome, which is correct. And you'll see that there's crowns upon the heads themselves. And then when they get to Revelation here, Revelation 13, you'll see that they have the beast, which looks quite different because it's not a dragon, but it's going to have 10 horns, and there's crowns upon the horns. And they understood it quite differently than you will see it presented in evangelistic series, because they understood that when it was pagan Rome, that these heads represented different phases or different parts of the Roman government. So they divided the Roman government, and I don't remember all the details about how they saw it, but I know it's very different from how we would teach it nowadays. One is we'd probably miss out that detail, but also the timing of when it is. We know that Revelation 12 is dealing with the birth of Christ. It's dealing with that time period. Now it's going to bring you to the period where the papacy is going to persecute the seed of the woman. So it's obviously going to bring you to, from the birth of Christ, to the 1260 years of papal supremacy. Now, when you get to chapter 3, we have a difference here. So we have crowns upon these 10 horns. And we would, when we say that this is papal Rome, we know that here this is different than what we see in Revelation 17. So maybe we should go to Revelation 17 and look at the differences there. And if anybody has any thoughts on these, I definitely welcome any thoughts, because as a Seventh-day Adventist, I've gone through lots of different views through the years, from when I first became an Adventist, of different books I read. People had different views. And I don't know if I've totally sorted out my understanding of these various beasts. But one of the things we see in Revelation 17, in verse 3, so he carried me away into the spirit into the wilderness. So one of the differences that we might notice is this other beast comes up out of the sea, and then this beast is in the wilderness. And I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-colored beast. So like the great red dragon, we can see that it's scarlet-colored, full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 7 horns. And if you read through this, you can see that there's 7 heads and 7 horns, but it doesn't say anything about, let me see here, it talks about 7 heads and 10 horns again in verse 7. And then it's going to say, so when it talks about those heads, it's going to go in more detail in verse 10. The 7 heads are 7 mountains in verse 9. So it's telling us these heads are mountains. Mountains represent kingdoms, and they're kingdoms upon which the woman sitteth. There are 7 kings, 5 are fallen, 1 is, the other is not yet come, and when he cometh, he must continue a short space. The 10 horns, it says, that thou sawest are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom of as yet, but receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. So when we look at this one, these horns and these heads do not have crowns upon them, and they're representing something different than what they represented in each of the other beasts. And I think that that's such an important distinction, because we just see 7 heads. We think those 7 heads are the same 7 heads in each manifestation of the beast. So the beast is talking about a power that exists at the time of Christ, a power that exists in 1798, and then finally in 17, the power that exists at the end of the world. And so this distinction is very important to understand it. Now, we know that when John in Revelation 17, well, I shouldn't say we know. There's different ways people look at it. But when we see him, where we try to place him, he's not, even though he's being what I would call at the end of the world, it's clear that he's at the end of the world that's beginning in 1798. So we can see that Revelation 13 is dealing with 1798. It's dealing with the rise of the United States. Or Revelation 13 is the rise of the United States at that period, because, well, we're going to have to look at that in more detail when we go back there. But in Revelation 17, it's showing the connection between the events in 1798 and the events at the end of the world. So from the perspective of John, there isn't this long period of time, or there isn't this distinction between what happens in Revelation 13. It's the start of something in Revelation 13. Revelation 17 is the end of that something. And one of the ways we can know that is the context in which he places this vision. So he's dealing, one, with the martyrs. There's so many little details that I don't want to spend time on. So we know that one of the differences that we can look at between Revelation 17 and 13 as well is we have this woman who's riding this beast. We don't have that in Revelation 13. Revelation 17, the woman is riding this beast. And so there's a distinction here between the beast and the woman herself, but that distinction doesn't exist in Revelation 13. That beast is papal Rome, and it's referring to the end of that period of 1260 years of papal persecution. But now when we get to Revelation 17, we see that that period has passed. So the persecution period has passed. And this is going to be the judgment then of that woman, or the great whore, or the papacy. But it's happening over a long period of time, and you can't see that this is covering a long period of time. If you're just trying to place it in that time, you don't realize that the connection between 1798 and our time, that's what we're trying to understand. And that right now we would look at it as a long period of time. But from a prophetic view, it's not a long period of time. It's actually the same period. Our period that we're in now is, and we're going to see that, is the time of the end that began in 1798. Now, we also have a time of the end in our time, 1989. But what I want to show is that connection between 1798 and 1989 brings them together to be the same period. They're both the same thing. They're not two separate periods. And this distinction, or the way that I see it, I'm having a hard time expressing myself here because there's a whole bunch of other ideas. But what I've seen is that people have tried to look at our line as if it's a separate line from the line of the Millerites. And it is, because we are repeating Millerite history. But it's the same line. It's not a separate line in the sense that we're part of that line. That's part of our history. The 4 generations of Adventism, we are part of Adventism. We have a new movement within Adventism, but we're still Seventh-day Adventists, and we're still, in a sense, Millerites. We come from that period of time. And it's the same period of time. There's 4 messages, and we're going to look at that. So when you're dealing with this idea, in verse 3, it says, "So he carried me away into the spirit in the wilderness." Now, the wilderness is United States, because that's where the woman went to flee. She fled into the wilderness in Revelation 12. And this is where we are. We're in the United States. The United States has formed. And this woman now is sitting upon this beast. So there's this separation from this woman and the beast itself. But then we have a problem. We're going to have these 7 heads, and these 7 heads are referring to periods of time, and we would take them as Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome pagan, Rome papal, the United States, and the United Nations. Now, the woman who's riding the beast is also represented in the head. But when we look at the head, that's referring to the political power, where the woman represents a church. And so you can see that there's this distinction between the church, the papacy, from its religious aspects, and the papacy from its state aspects, from its political aspects. So we know that in 1798, the papacy lost, it received the deadly wound. That's what's being talked about in Revelation 17. And in doing that, it lost its political influence, but it did not die. That is, it had received a deadly wound, but the papacy, the church itself, still existed. And that woman is then controlling or riding these powers all through this. And we can see that she's been doing this from the beginning, even though the papacy never began until 538. The papacy as a religion is this mystery religion, as it says in verse 5, "And upon her head was written, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth." So we can see that the papacy, as we try to look at it in this aspect, has continued from Babylon. It's not a different religion. It's changed its form. Paganism has been transformed in the 6th century into papalism, but it's still the same. It's still these spiritualistic, anti-God type of worship. It's spiritualism. It's Satanism, even if you wanted to put it that way. It's not a worship of God. It's a worship of man, or the principles of Satan. So when we look at Revelation 17 and Revelation 13 and Revelation 12, we can see that there are these differences. And we know and understand that when we look at Revelation 17, that these 10 kings that have not received a kingdom as yet is referring to the United Nations. So when the United States rose in 1798, there is no United Nations. And that's really where we're trying to look at. We're going to try to deal with this history, and hopefully we can put it all together here in this study. So let's go back to Revelation 13. So we know that we have this power, and the other power that we have is the two-horned beast, right? So the two-horned beast is going to arise. And so here it's called the second beast in my Bible. But I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had two horns like a lamb, and he spake as a dragon. So we can see that the United States, republicanism and Protestantism are the two horns. We know that. That's church and state, if we want to look at it that way. And there's this separation of church and state, the principles upon which the United States is founded. Republicanism is a government run by a constitution. It's not really, it has democratic aspects to it, but it's not a rule to the whim of the democracy. The Constitution is supposed to protect from that. And then we also have Protestantism. And Protestantism was a reaction to church and state combined to persecute. And so when the Protestants arose, it was about freedom of religion and many other things too. The scriptures instead of tradition. But the United States is founded upon these principles. Without Protestantism, you can't really have a republic, because Protestantism provides the character needed in order for a state that is republican to function. If you do not have good citizens, a republic will not stand. So there's a problem with the republic, just as there are with all types of governments. But the republic, in order for it to operate, people have to have a character. They have to be responsible citizens. So this is a problem with the republic, which is why the United States is falling. Has to do not so much with its government, but it has to do with the people themselves. Now, we know that this has two horns like a lamb, but it also speaks as a dragon. And of course, the speaking has to do with the laws and the legislations. So this is obviously talking about Sunday law, ultimately. And he's going to exercise all the power of the first beast before him. And he's going to cause the earth and them which dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. So we have this context. When you go to Revelation 14, we sometimes just read it, as I said. We don't think about Revelation 13. But the message is directly addressing Revelation 13, as we will see. And he doeth great wonders, so that he maketh fire come down from heaven on earth in the sight of men. So this is a counterfeit power, or spiritual power. So the United States is going to do what in the time of Elijah only God could do. The United States is going to have this power. They're going to seemingly have the power of God. And deceiveth them that dwell on the earth by means of those miracles which he had power to do in the sight of the beast, saying to them that dwell on the earth that they should make an image to the beast which had the wound by a sword and did live. So we know that the image of the beast has to do with the connection of church and state. It's separate from the mark of the beast, but we often think of it as the same thing. But it precedes the mark of the beast. And he had power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. And then it says, he causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads. So this is the mark of the beast, and we know that this mark has to do with Sunday worship. So we're all familiar with this as Seventh-day Adventists. And no man might buy or sell, save he had the mark, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name. Here is wisdom, let him that hath understanding count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. Now, it is true that we can take various names, and we can take the title of the Pope, the Vicar of the Son of God, Vicarius Filii Dei, and we can add up those Roman numerals, and we can come to 666 as a total. Now, some people have argued that this is not to be understood in that way, but the way it's written in the Greek, it's clear that it's actually a number. So this mark of the beast, 666, comes from Babylon. And I've showed this in other studies that we can connect Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28, these two sieges that are talked about, by a period of 666 years. And it shows that from Babylon to Rome, that this principle, this mystery religion has continued. And we know that the papacy is then a change from paganism to papalism, but it is in its very spirit is still paganism. Even though there's no animal sacrifices anymore, it still has the principles of paganism operating it. Any thoughts about the mark of the beast? This number. Has anybody thought much about it? Because we know that it can represent different things. People have all kinds of theories about the mark of the beast. Not just in the Christian world, but even within Adventism. But there's some aspects to it, because we know we have a 777 in our line. We have more than one 777. 777 becomes our message. And 6 is the number of man. 6 refers to the day that man was created. So man was created on the 6th day. And this repeat of it is really about man. Where when we see 777, that is a message about the Sabbath. And so we can see that the Sabbath was made for man, but the papacy and pagan religions and so forth, they put man above God. So that's, to me, the basic symbolism of 666, why it's a number, has to do with that. But it also comes from Babylon. And with Babylon, this number 666 has to do with their astrology. That is, they had the sky divided into 36 decans, or periods of, decades, I think. I can't remember the word that they use. But basically, that's why we have 360 degrees in a circle, is they divided the sky into 36 sections, and each one of them is divided into 10. And so it's part of their astronomy. Or their astrology, right? So they're looking at the skies, they're looking at these constellations, and they have a belief about magical powers. So the Babylonian magic square becomes a symbol of that religion, because it's 36 squares that when you add 1 plus 2 plus 3 all the way up to plus 36, you get 666. But it's also the 36 squares represent the 36 constellations or gods that are in the heavens, and every year the sun, passes through these different constellations, and that's how they mark when their God is that's the time of their God, when the sun is in that constellation. And there's other things to it. So they're looking at the stars as they move the planets, because the planets move through the constellations in the line of the ecliptic, and so does the moon. So they look at the sun and the moon and the planets and how they move through this cycle of the ecliptic. So we don't often think about that. We focus upon the 666, the Pope's name written on a mitre, which some people claim doesn't exist, but I believe it does, or it did, with Vicarius Filii Dei on it. But that title was also used by the Pope at times. But it's not so much about the Pope, and that's kind of my point, is that this is about something much deeper than just trying to label the Pope with this title, because we can take 666 and apply it to different people. Throughout history, people have made a case that it could be applied to Nero, who was the Emperor of Rome. And so in trying to limit it, I think we have to understand it. We have to understand that what this symbolizes, not so much in its literal sense that we can find this name. So now we've looked at Revelation 13, and what we want to do is we want to look at Revelation 14 and beyond. So we're going to look at the three angels' messages. So I hope that was clear. And there's a whole context that now is placed here when we get to Revelation 14 that, I find it hard to teach Revelation without starting from the beginning and establishing some points. So I'm going to have to be going back there again and again to different parts of Revelation. And then, of course, you can't understand Revelation without understanding other parts of the Bible and how they relate. So when we get here to Revelation 14, the first thing is we see is the 144,000. I looked, and lo, a lamb stood upon the Mount Zion, and with him 144,000, having his Father's name written in their foreheads. So one is we see a contrast to the mark of the beast that we just read about, where the people who worship the beast in his image have the number 666, or the mark of the beast, on their right hand or their foreheads. And now we see that the 144,000 stand in contradiction to that, and they have their Father's name written on their foreheads. Now, this idea of a forehead deals with the thoughts, and the hand deals with the actions. We don't have the seal of God, or God's name, written on our hands. It's written on our foreheads. Now, and Angela is referring me to the mark of Cain, which we talk about the 7 times. That so he has a mark placed upon him, and anybody who was to hurt Cain was to receive a curse 7 times. Now, so this vengeance that would happen as Angela marks in her note. So, and I think this is an important point again, that, and it goes to exactly what I'm talking about. These marks on the forehead are representing our character. But a person can receive the mark of the beast just by his actions himself. He doesn't need to necessarily intellectually buy into everything. But how you act, we know that the wicked are judged by their works. The righteous are justified by faith, but the wicked are judged by their works. God does not judge the righteous by their works. He only judges the wicked by their works, because the righteousness are justified by faith. Because if we look at our works, all our righteousnesses are filthy rags. And so we have a transformation of character. Of course, if we look at our whole life, we're going to have acts of sin throughout our life. But even once we develop a Christ-like character and we're no longer participating in sin, we still can't take our works, because part of those works are unrighteousness, even in the past. So the wicked are judged by their works and also by their words. They're judged by their actions and the things that they say. But the righteous are judged by faith. They're justified by faith. They're made righteous by faith. So there's a transformation that happens with the righteous. So it's just a little sermon on the side there, dealing with righteousness by faith. Now, so we have the 144,000. They have their Father's name written in their foreheads. So they have a transformation of character. They reflect the character of Christ. The glory of God is seen upon his people in the 144,000. And they're going to sing a new song. And the context of this, there's a lot to this song, and I'm not going to deal with it so much, but it's the song of their victory, of their experience. And they have an experience that's unique to the other redeemed. So we know that many people teach that the 144,000 is just all of the redeemed at the end of time. And so they just say that it looks like 144,000, but it's really the great multitude. You'll see all these kinds of views. But the 144,000 is a literal number, but it has symbolic aspects. I mean, it's symbolic, but it's still literal, because all the numbers in Scripture, even when they're symbolic, they're still literal. You know, you can't have there would be no significance if it was just purely symbolic. So we have to apply it literally as well as symbolically. And we had for a while people teaching that the 144,000 were only the priests, which is a false teaching. The 144,000 represents Seventh-day Adventists at the end of the world who do not taste death and are alive when Jesus comes without seeing death. So they have an experience, and they sing this song, which is the song of their experience. And they were redeemed from the earth. So they sing a new song before the throne. And it says, these are they which were not defiled with women. So that means they're not part of false worship. There are people who are going to be saved who are not going to be part of the 144,000. And they would have been defiled with women. That is, they're saved, but they do not have a pure faith. They're saved because they choose at the time to follow God, but they don't understand everything about what God's message is at the end of the world. So these would be people that come in and don't have an opportunity to learn the teachings and doctrines of Scripture completely, right? So there are going to be a group of people. So we're going to talk about that. These follow the Lamb whithersoever he goeth. And this to me would refer to the understanding of the sanctuary message. So we would see that the Lamb is slain, and we would understand in Christ's ministry as the sacrifice, his blood going into the heavenly sanctuary, and all the work that Christ does, not just as the Lamb, but as the high priest. So we follow the work of the Lamb. But many religions are not going to understand that message, and many people will be saved who do not understand the sanctuary message. These were redeemed from among men, being the firstfruits unto God and to the Lamb. Now, this idea of firstfruits is used also in connection with those that were resurrected at Christ's resurrection. But we also have this idea of firstfruits here with a group of people that actually does not die. So the 144,000 are not going to die, but they're going to be the firstfruits. And we know that there are a group that's the firstfruits of them that slept. But these are the firstfruits that don't die. So they don't sleep. So there's these two distinctions of these two types of firstfruits. And in their mouth was found no guile, for they are without fault before the throne of God. So these people have a perfect character, and the words that they speak are true. Their actions are true. Their character is true. So they have the mind of Christ, the Father's name written on their foreheads, and the words that they speak are truth. So they're not teaching false doctrine in any way. So in understanding the 144,000, and we're going to try to understand it as we put it on a line. So let's look at the three angels' messages. So I know we're so familiar with them, but sometimes there are things that we miss out. And so maybe we can see them a little more clearly than we have in the past. And I saw another angel fly in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach unto them that dwell on the earth, to every nation and kindred, tongue and people, saying with a loud voice, Fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment is come, and worship him that made heaven and earth, the sea, and the fountains of waters. Now, we know where we can place this. So we're going to go back over here, 1798. And we know we can place it here for a number of things. We saw that we are in Revelation 13, and Revelation 13 is here. So you have Revelation 13, and then you're going to have Revelation 14. And Revelation 14 is going to be a message that's addressing what's happening here in Revelation 13. So we see that we're going to have this two-horn power that's going to rise in 1798. According to Ellen White in The Great Controversy, that's when the United States arrives. It fulfills that condition after the end of 1260 years. And so it's at this time that we would call the time of the end. But we would then place the first angel as arriving here. So I'm going to do it here. So the first angel arrives. And this is what we used to always teach, though we have sort of taken out some of these details. And I got to go to this board. I got to stop this. Okay, so we got this here. Hopefully you can see that. Okay, so we got 1798 here. The first angel arrives. And it's talking about a judgment that's going to be coming. Fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment is come. And then it refers back to language from the fourth commandment. Worship him who made the heaven and earth, the sea, and the fountains of waters. And yet here, in this period of history, we don't have the Sabbath message proclaimed at the beginning of this. But it's concealed or hidden within the first angel's message. So we know that this judgment is coming, but this judgment that's coming is going to be addressing the Sabbath. So William Miller would look at this, and he would just say, and I'm doing it this way, I'm kind of going to jam a bunch of stuff in here. But we're going to have 1844. Now, he had 1843, and he figured this out in 1818, that in about 25 years that Jesus would come back. So he looks at this judgment as Christ's return. We know it's 1844, but we know that the message is going to be about the judgment. And of course, he knows it's going to be the cleansing of the sanctuary. But the first angel's message is addressing this history because it's addressing this judgment that's coming. Even though they didn't fully understand it, that's what the first angel's message was addressing, this judgment that's going to happen in 1844. Now, we, in looking at that verse, fear God, give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment is come, we see it as a three-step aspect. So we often have done this. We're going to put the second angel's message here. We're going to say the second angel arrives. And we're going to have the third angel arrives. So we're going to put that here. You'll see as we get through that. So we deal with this. This is fear God. Give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment has come. I guess I probably could have put it up here. I'll do it up there. So you're going to fear God. Give him glory, for the hour of his judgment has come. And so we would see that this is 1, 2, 3 of these messages, but they're all concealed or contained within this first angel's message. That is, it's a three-step testing prophetic message. Now, I don't know, early on in this message, in in 2007, 8, 9, they would always talk about Jesus when he talks about the Comforter, for he can convince the world of sin, righteousness, and judgment. So they would talk about here, I'm just going to get rid of that. So they would look at this as sin, righteousness, and judgment, right? They would put these together. Fear God, give glory to him. And so this would be about the conviction of sin. Righteousness is just God's character, his glory, and judgment. So they would lay these down on top of each other. The first, second, and third angel's message are contained in the first, fear God, give glory, and judgment. And then they would look at Jesus' words when he talks about the Comforter, when he's talking to Nicodemus. For he shall convict the world of sin, righteousness, of judgment. On sin, because they believe not. On me, on righteousness, because I go to my Father. And on judgment, because the prince of this world is judged. And Ellen White says, and soon to be cast out. So these three steps here, we have lots of examples of three steps. We see them in the three decrees. God always has these, his dealings with man are ever the same. He uses this pattern of three. But we see it's contained in the first one. Now, we also know, and I'm not going to deal with all of this here, but we know the message ends up being formalized, right? And there's different ways we can look at this. We could also talk about the increase of knowledge, the message being formalized, and then the message being empowered. So the first message, or the first, I guess I'd go first angel formalized, and first angel empowered. And it would be empowered August 11th, 1840. So this is the first angel's message, and it's going to contain the second and third. Now, the reason why the second and third messages occur is that each message has to accomplish its work in order for the second message to have any bearing. If you had the first message and nobody responds to it, there would be nobody to go through the second message. There'd be nobody to give it, because this message is given by God's people. But also there would be no way that, there'd be no reason to have that message of obviously if nobody's giving it, but there would be no work for it to do. You have to have a people who go through the experience of the first message to get the second. And then you have to have people go through the second message to receive the third. Without a first and a second, you can't have the third. So they're always together, and they're doing a work of reform. These are reform lines. Now, the second angel's message really directly goes back to Revelation 13. And there followed another angel, so I'll bring this up again so people can see it.
Theodore, if I may quickly.
Yeah.
It's just like what Ellen White says, if you didn't get John the Baptist and his message, then you wouldn't have gotten Jesus' message later. Kind of that same parallel.
Yeah, there's a parallel there for sure. So it says in verse 8, and there followed another angel saying, Babylon is fallen. Is fallen, that great city, because she made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. So we have here the second angel's message. It's quite short, and it's the message that Babylon has fallen. So we're going to address this in a lot more detail as we go along. So the second angel's message has to do with Babylon. And we also know that it says Babylon is fallen, is fallen. It has to do with the doubling, right? So this message has to do with the doubling. It's the fall of Babylon. And trying to understand the relationships between the first, second, and third angel's message, I think the key is understanding Babylon in this context, because we know that the first angel's message is talking about this judgment that's coming. And this judgment has, when we look at it as Seventh-day Adventists, we know that this judgment is the investigative judgment in heaven. And God's people are being judged here. So when we have this message about Babylon, the issue is not so much the judgment of Babylon, it's God's people who have to come out of Babylon. They have to come out of Babylon so that they can stand in the judgment and pass that judgment. Now, so Babylon is fallen. We're now going to look at this context here because we know that this second angel arrives. We've had disputes in this movement. I shouldn't maybe say disputes, but changes that has happened is we've changed our ideas as time has gone on. So go back here. So the second angel's message arrives. And the question is, why does it arise? Now, I'm going to go back to something that Bronwyn talked about, which I think is a really important point. And she talked about how that the world, we've been looking to the world, and she might have even meant it in a different way than the way that I take it, but she was saying that the world is not the pattern. It's not the cause of what happens. What happens in the world is a result of what happens in the church. That is, God's people are actually, in a sense, creating what's happening in the world. And we're creating it because we're giving a message, and that message does a work of separating the true from the false. So, and it's more complicated than that. I can't think of how to express it. But often when we look at this Babylon falling, and we're going to see that as we especially get into our history, is a result of people who are giving a message. So they're giving this message. If this message isn't given, Babylon doesn't fall. You have to give this message first in order for Babylon to fall. So I'm going to try to illustrate that, what I mean by that. But I don't know how to do it. I don't know how to do it effectively, but we'll see if we can figure it out. So we have this first, second, and third angel's message. We know that the second message is about Babylon. But these are messages all addressing this judgment. And ultimately what they're going to be leading to is to the final message, the fourth angel's message, which is the second angel's message again. So we're going to see that this message of Babylon is going to be a constant theme throughout this history. So we know that the Protestant churches here, which form the United States has two horns. One is republicanism and one is Protestantism. But now when they form here, they're going to receive a message. And that message is the first angel's message. So the United States is this place during the 1260 years that ultimately the woman or the church flees to this wilderness, and this becomes the promised land for spiritual Israel. And then they're going to form into a country, and they're going to have this separation of church and state. And they have all good intentions in everything that they're going to do. But then a message is going to be given to this country that has this separation of church and state, that's founded upon godly principles, because it came out of Babylon, which it did. It came out of Babylonian captivity. It came out of Egypt. It came out of the papacy, from papal persecution, and started a country which is founded upon God's principles. But then they're going to have a message being given to them. And that message is going to say that God's judgment is going to come. And we know here that there's this increase of knowledge that occurs with William Miller. But we also know that there's an increase of knowledge that occurs within Christianity itself. Christianity is studying the Bible in ways that it wasn't able to before. And it's also giving the gospel to the world. Christianity has these mission stations all over the world. Christianity has, this time you have the Bible societies forming. God's word, after this period of persecution, now becomes available to everyone. And so with that knowledge of God being available, God can now give a message where he wants to take this nation of the United States, he wants to bring them to the place where they can now be God's denominated people. Because the nation of Israel failed in their mission during the time period of the persecution. And when we look at that, the joining of the two sticks, when we see those sticks separated, and I'm going to try to come back to that idea of what happened, because we did deal with it. We did deal with the idea that the period of persecution happened first under pagan Rome, and then under papal Rome after Christianity rose. After the Jewish nation lost its denomination in 34 AD at the stoning of Stephen, we have now persecution that's happening. The scattering of the power of the holy people is occurring still, and it's completed on the first period under pagan persecution, and then the treading down is going to occur under the 1200 years of papal persecution. So when the United States rises here, it's come out of Babylon, because the papacy is Babylon. It's Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots. It's come out of this false worship, and it's now establishing a church, but it's not got a pure faith. One of the things is doesn't have a sanctuary, and it doesn't have the Sabbath. These two things are essential for true worship. And this is what's going to happen, is that the sanctuary is going to be restored, and the Sabbath is going to be restored. Now, so I'm jumping back to some other ideas that we haven't actually addressed. But if we look at the story of Nehemiah, well, we have the story of Ezra and Nehemiah. These are two reform lines. In the story of Ezra, it was about being married to strange women, and there was a reform that had to occur where they had to divorce their foreign wives legally so that they were taken care of. And in the story of Nehemiah, we have two parts to it that most people don't notice. The one part, we all know it's about the Sabbath. So the issue was, in Nehemiah's time, is that they weren't observing the Sabbath at all. You know, they were having, you know, they're selling to the nations around them. They were trading on the Sabbath. The city was open for trade. And so Nehemiah did this Sabbath reform. The other part of Nehemiah that's not noticed is that they mourn for a particular reason. And that reason is they can't keep the Day of Atonement. They decide to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. And I'm not going to go through a whole study of Nehemiah. But the reason that they can't keep the Day of Atonement is there is no ark in the sanctuary. They can't go through the process of the Day of Atonement. And they're mourning over that fact. But then they are directed to keep the Feast of Tabernacles, which follows the Day of Atonement. So this issue then has to do with the sanctuary and the Sabbath in the time of Nehemiah. Now, I'm just going to illustrate this because we know that at the beginning of the 2300 days, we have this reform line. We have Cyrus's decree, we have Darius's decree, and we have Artaxerxes' decree. Now, we also have in 444, we have Nehemiah's decree. Now, this is Artaxerxes' second decree, but we'll just call it Nehemiah's decree, even though he doesn't make the decree. And this would be the first message, the second message, the third message. And in 444, we have the fourth message, or the first, second, third, and fourth decrees. If this is going to start the 2300 days. So we know that we're going to have this fourth follow it. And that's going to follow after the 2300 days, right? So when the 2300 days ends. So you're going to have the 2300 days begin, 2300, and then you're going to have this other reform line, and it's also going to have a first, a second, and a third, and the 2300 days actually ends here. And then after that, you're going to have a fourth. So this here, this fourth, is going to address the Sabbath and the sanctuary. Now, this, of course, when you deal with all of these here, they're all dealing with the laying of the foundation of the temple, the rebuilding of the sanctuary, and then there's a separation from the women or the strange wives that happens here under Artaxerxes. And then finally, you're going to have the Sabbath and the sanctuary reform occur under this fourth message. So we always say a reform line is a three-step testing prophetic message, but it's always followed by a fourth. These three, though, are a unit unto themselves, and this fourth is something else, because with this, there's a change of dispensation that occurs with the fourth. At least that's the way I would use it. That might be misunderstood by people, but something changes here. So we know, and this is connected with this. This fourth and third are connected together. Even in the story of Nehemiah and Artaxerxes, or of Ezra, so Ezra and Nehemiah, those two books, they're really the same story. This fourth is just the result of these first three. But then it culminates in this reform line that restores true worship. So here it's dealing with the Sabbath. But the sanctuary worship, if you look at this reform line is incomplete, because the sanctuary is not cleansed here. It's not cleansed here. It's not cleansed until the end of the 2300 days with another reform line. And even though the Sabbath is restored here, what happens in this reform line in the beginning of, this is actually the beginning, we would call it the first generation, it's going to lead finally to a period of darkness. So even though this is a reform line, and there's some good things here, I'm not saying there's anything bad, but that what's accomplished here is taken by the Jews, both here and here. So what happens to the Jews? What is the problem in the time of Christ? They have added to man's law, or to God's law, man's rules, to try to support God's law. And they become exclusive and separate from the nations around them, because they don't want to fall into the same trap as their fathers. So they don't want to neglect the Sabbath, and they don't want to mix with the foreigners so that they get false worship. And they're very particular about the law. So they got out of one ditch and they went into another ditch. And that's because a reform line in and of itself cannot reform. It cannot do the work that God has to do. It can illustrate what God wants to do, but man is still the same. Man is not changed. And so man will continue. Whatever reform line has happened in the past, man continues to pervert it, and it turns into a period of darkness. And the period of darkness relates to the previous reform line, and then the new reform line that follows that period of darkness is always going to address this new manifestation of darkness that has resulted from a previous reform that failed. So I'm trying to put this in a way that people can connect it all. Now, and I'm putting it in the context of the joining of the two sticks. Probably I could have put it in the context of some other studies, but I don't think that we can understand the joining of the two sticks in our time if we don't understand how these reform lines work and what has happened in the past. So we run into a stumbling block because we've got some error mixed in with our reform lines. And it's hard to sort of pick it out, because sometimes the truth is so intertwined with error that if I try to pull out that error, I'm in danger of pulling out a truth. I'm in danger of confounding the two and thinking that I'm getting rid of an error only, but I'm actually missing out something that error was meant to conceal or hide or to destroy. So that truth that was the error, the reason why error is used is two reasons. It makes, or truth is mixed with error. Truth, when mixed with error, makes the error more palatable, but it also is meant to hide that truth. So that error, so that truth, the truth that we need to understand, Satan will have it manifest in a counterfeit way so that when the truth does come, we don't recognize it. And a good example of this would be the movement that happened in the 1980s in Adventism, which was the repeat of Revelation 11. So this idea of Revelation 11, before Elder Jeff started to understand it, there were people like Charles Wieland who were teaching the repeat of history, but they were doing it in a wrong way. So they were mixing error with it. There was a lot of fanaticism connected with it, and there was all kinds of error. So they were doing time setting about when Jesus is going to come back, or different elements are going to happen. We also had the 1987 Jubilee, which was a time setting movement that was teaching that Jesus was going to come back in 1987. So we had these counterfeits come before 1989. And so as we start to have a message of truth, there's so much error that people just reject the truth. They don't even look at it. So dealing with reform lines, we have to understand that we've had in our message error, but it's sometimes the particular truth that's attached to that error that we then reject. And so we have to be very careful that if we're getting rid of that error, we're not also plucking up the truth. So I'm not sure I have all the answers to what all the errors are, but I do know that we have a misunderstanding of the reform lines. And I'm not even sure how it came about, and I'm not even sure how to correct it. But when we look at what the best way to do it, I think, is to actually look at what's in the Bible and what's revealed in the spirit of prophecy. And this is something we all have to do, because I haven't completed it. But I know, the other thing that I do know is that when this message of, I'm just going to say it really plainly, when I introduced this to Parminder, this idea of the 4 generations being connected to a reform line and that they created this chain, he told me that he didn't understand what I was talking about. And that's a code word for Parminder, that what you're teaching is error. I can't, or is, he doesn't agree with it. He knows it's true, but he thinks it's error, but I don't have an answer. So I'm just going to say I don't understand. And this way I don't have to address what you're saying. And I can make it look like I'm understanding you, you know, that I'm trying to understand you. I just don't understand. I don't understand what you're talking about. And I introduced this to him back in 2015. And he didn't oppose it. He just would say he didn't understand it. And it was actually quite easy to understand. The idea I was presenting then was pretty simple. I could illustrate all of these progressive destructions of 4 followed by a reform line. But he wasn't interested in it. And other times this also came up, but every single time, and even when Jeff did it in 2010 at the Oklahoma camp meeting where he dealt with the prophetic chain, which was a 3-1 combination, that message got buried because of the separation that was beginning to happen in 2010. It didn't manifest itself till 2014, but there was a dissatisfaction that was happening with Jeff with all these ministries that had joined FFA. So we got sidetracked on different issues that started to come up at that time. So I know that there's something about this truth that if we can put these reform lines together, then we can see the connection between the past and the present. And that's the only reason why we look at the past, is we want to understand the present. So I'm not doing a very good job of explaining this, I can see by your reactions. But anyway, so we have this reform line here at the end. And what we want to look at is this reform line here. So we would say the third angel arrives here. Now, if you read in the Spirit of Prophecy, she says that the third angel arrived on October 22nd, 1844. And that this angel is going to continue. So you're going to have this third angel, and it's going to continue all the way through until it's joined by another angel. And so this other angel is going to join it. And this is what we would call the fourth angel. So the fourth angel is going to join the third angel. Now, the way that it does it is it's going to swell, and it's going to swell into a loud cry. So I could probably even, put this on a line and show it a line going up. The other angel is going to come and join it. So it's going to join this third angel. Now, in looking at this line here, this has been attacked within this movement. So the idea was that, I can't really do this without talking about Parminder's ideas. I apologize. But what Parminder would do is he did something very tricky and subtle. So he said, this was the third angel, but this third angel was supposed to accomplish its work in this early history, which is true. So the third angel was meant to accomplish its work. And what we ended up having is we had another reform line. And the way that I would parallel this, I'm going to do this way. I'm going to take this line and just draw it right under here. So we know that we have Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes. But we're then going to have Nehemiah. And we can see that Nehemiah is going to represent this history here after 1844, because he's going to be dealing with the Sabbath and the sanctuary that needs to be cleansed. But in this history, this cleansing of the sanctuary is going to begin, right? So this is going to be the fourth. So the fourth angel arrives. Now, we say that Ellen White is looking from here. She's saying the third angel is going to continue all the way through, and then it's going to be joined by another angel. And that other angel, the fourth angel, is really the second angel, and we'll look at that. But we can see that this period of reform here is reflected in this history. Now, under Nehemiah, we know that there's a construction that goes on. This is the construction of the construction of the streets and walls. So we have a number of things here. We have the Sabbath is going to be an issue here. And there's going to be a building that's going to occur here. And that building being described as the streets and walls, there's lots of symbolism in that. I mean, walls represent, of course, they're the walls of the city, but they can represent God's law. Streets can represent channels of communication or organization, because when you have streets and roads, that means you have a civilization, you have organization. And where I would place this is I would place this in 1863. Now, some people might want to put this somewhere else, but I'm not really distinguishing. I'm kind of putting 1863 as the center of this, even though this is a whole history. And we know Elder Jeff is dealing with this history right now. You could look at 1846. You can look at baptism, the Sabbath, and marriage, and all these different things. We can look at the 1850 chart. But when we look here, what Jeff is saying is that this is a period of rebellion. Now, and that's because the building that goes on here is the rebuilding of Jericho. And here, this is the building of Jerusalem, the streets and the walls. So when we look at these parallels here, what I'm trying to illustrate is that in this history, this is the first generation after they come to the land. This is part of this is the end of a reform line. This is the beginning of a prophetic, a progressive destruction of four. And we know that when this reform actually happens, we're going to have Christ's reform line. So you're going to have 4 generations, and in the 4th generation, you're going to have a period of darkness, and then you're going to have here, you're going to have the cross. So I'm just going to draw a line here. Right? And you're going to have the 1st generation, which is going to end in 408. And then you're going to have a 2nd generation, a 3rd generation. And I'm not going to deal with these histories here, but this is dealing with the Jews in this intertestamental period, which most of us are not familiar with. And then you're going to have this 4th generation. And in the 4th generation, Christ is going to come. And he comes after the period of darkness. And the period of darkness exists in the 4th generation. And you're going to have the same thing here. You're going to have this 1st generation. In 1888, it's going to end. And then you're going to have a 2nd generation, 1919. And then you're going to have the 4th generation in 1957. And then you're going to have a new reform line. And this is the reform line of the 144,000, at least is how we call it. Though this whole reform line is the reform line of the 144,000. And this whole reform line here, this is about the sanctuary or the temple. This is the literal temple. Christ is going to come and illustrate what this is all about. Kind of not a good explanation of that because there's more to it. But we can look at this parallel here and we can see that there's this failed reform in Nehemiah's time, in this 1st generation. And we can also see then that this parallels here. What happened here in Nehemiah's time was good. But the thing is, it became perverted as you moved through this here. Now here we would say, well, this isn't good. 1863, we have the rebuilding of Jericho. But the rebuilding of Jericho, even though it occurs at the same time as the organization of Adventism, the building of the church is not a bad thing. It's only bad in the context that the people themselves are not ready for this building. So does somebody have a comment at all on any of this? I don't know if you're following it, because I'm a little bit all over the place trying to build this line and trying to show you the joining of the 2 sticks in our history. But if we look at this here, we know 1863 is the organization of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. It's the end of the prophetic mirror. There's all kinds of good things happening, but there's also bad things. And that bad things is, I would say, it's the rejection of the prophetic foundation, even though they don't realize they're doing that, because it's the rejection of the 7 times, the 25-20. And it's the rejection of the 7 times that's the rebuilding of Jericho. The church being formed here is not the rebuilding of Jericho in and of itself. I believe that the church should form, they should organize to accomplish their work. Just like Nehemiah, there was nothing wrong with Nehemiah addressing with the Sabbath, and with Artaxerxes here, separation from the strange wives. These are good things, but they get perverted in this history. So all that's done here becomes perverted in this history because they've rejected something that was established in this reform line here. They didn't fully understand it. So when God establishes his church, this church should go on to accomplish its work, but it doesn't. Because in the 1st generation, they lose their first love. The image of jealousy occurs. There's all kinds of parallels we can take from other reform lines of what happens here. But it's going to lead to, but there's also a rejection of the spirit of prophecy here. And that rejection of the spirit of prophecy is going to show its work. 1888 is going to show the result of that. Ellen White does not have the authority to correct people here. Very few people are accepting her testimony. It also ends up rejecting really the whole prophetic message here in 1919. And then in 1915, we have rejected our doctrines. And so we can parallel these with Ezekiel, Ezekiel chapter 8. There's so many different parallels, and I don't have time to go over all of them because we're familiar with some of them. The point that I'm trying to make as we start to address the joining of the 2 sticks is to address this history and how it's related to this history at the end. So hopefully we can make that happen. So I'm going to give you a break. So we're going to take 4 minutes off. So at 25:02, we will come back and try to finish off this whole study on the joining of the two sticks. I don't know if I can do it, but we'll see. Dear Father in heaven, we thank you, Lord, for all that are here today, studying. We just ask for your Holy Spirit to help us to understand these things. Whether I get through them all or not is not important. We know, Lord, there's many things we don't understand, and issues that can sometimes be difficult, and they can also cause division. We just ask, Lord, for the Holy Spirit to give us unity and help us to be submissive to your teaching. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so.
Amen.
So now what I want to try to do is I want to look at this concept here of this other angel. So we know that Ellen White says that the third angel continues all the way through. Now, where I've had problems that we have is in placing these angels here. So we know that this history here, where the second angel arrives, has changed in our understanding. So originally we would say the second angel arrives in 1842 when the Protestants begin to close their doors on the Adventists after the making of the 1843 chart. But we later came to understand that the second angel arrives when the Protestants fail their test, and they fail that test on April 19th. So we would then put this as April 19th, 1844. Now, we used to have this, and I'm kind of skipping some things to try to get things done here, but we used to have, the first angel arrives, it's formalized, it's empowered. The second angel arrives, it's formalized, empowered. And then the third angel arrives, but no formalization or empowerment of it. We would just say the third angel arrives. That's the way that we would draw it. If you look at, you can find a lot of these old PowerPoints online. The people lay out these first, second, and third angels' messages. They use this: fear God, give glory to him in the hour of his judgment, the sin, righteousness, and judgment ideas. And they're focusing upon these three steps, but they never went beyond it. Now, what we would just say is then that the fourth angel arrives over here, and that the first and second angel has to also arrive before the third angel, and the third angel has to arrive after the second angel. So the way that we would do it is we would do it like I did it here with the fourth angel in Millerite history in 1863, which I didn't really show you, that I put the fourth angel here, but there is also a first angel that arrives, and the fourth angel is the second. So I guess I'll draw it here. So I'm going to put 1863 here, and I'm going to say that this is the fourth, but it's also the first, the second, and the third. And the way that I've always done it, I would put that this first angel arriving is the first angel arriving here is when the Seventh-day Adventist Church make the 1850 chart. And then this is the 1863 chart, and then this is 1888. But when they make the 1850 chart, so that this is 50, they also become Laodicean. And then in 1888, they reject the third angel's message. And that's because they've already rejected the first and the second. They reject the second angel's message in 1863. One is they're using the methods of Protestantism to understand prophecy. But they reject the first angel's message in 1850 because this is fear God. They fail to give him glory, and then they fail here on the third step. So this is dealing with, obviously 1888 is dealing with righteousness by faith, the way we look at it, but it's also this whole period, even though it's God's trying to establish his church, it's also a period of rebellion as well. So rebellion happens all through here in 1850, 1863, and 1888. So we have this here, and this becomes the first generation, as I said, But now we're going to look at the time of the end here. So we came to understand 1989 is the time of the end. It's 1798. But this is now a reform line. This is a period of darkness. And we know that the first, second, and third angels' messages came here, but how was was the second angel's message? When we ask that question, if we ask that question to ourselves, we know that Babylon has fallen, has fallen. And if we go back here, we know that there's this lamb that has two horns. One of the horns is republicanism, the other one's Protestantism. And we know that Babylon falls here, but only one of the horn falls, and that horn is Protestantism. So I'm just going to get rid of this. So here, we're going to have the first horn fall. This horn is Protestantism. Protestantism has fallen because it's failed this test. And in the context of the two sticks, if we look at Protestantism, it's northern Israel. It's the north. It's the kingdom that has the golden calves in Dan and Bethel. It's the false prophet. And so Protestantism, when God establishes his church here, he starts to gather his people here at the end of the 2520 for northern Israel. Protestantism arises. God has this country that's supposed to be his country, where he's going to demonstrate his glory. And the Protestants get this message that's given to them, and they fail to accept that message. And so the first horn falls. So we can see that nation that arises in 1798, the United States, in Revelation 13, it begins to fall here. But one horn falls, and that's Protestantism. But it's still republicanism. So Protestantism failing is a failure in this reform line here. But we know that Protestantism is the first horn, and we know that this country, the United States, has two horns. And the second horn falls in our history. So some of you are familiar with that idea. So we're going to have this reform line here, and we've drawn it so many different ways, but I'm just going to draw it in a simple way. I'm going to say in 1989, the first angel arrives. And then I'm going to say at 9/11, the second angel arrives. Now, we parallel 9/11 with April 19th, 1844. Now, we know in this history, we also have August 11th, 1844, or 1840, and August 11th, 1840 is the empowerment of the first angel. In our history, it's also the first angel is empowered. In our history, the first angel is empowered when the second angel arrives, and not before. And I've always had a question why this is, and I don't know if I know the answer completely, but I've had some ideas about it. First off, in this history, these are the first, second, and third angel's message. And we know that the third angel's message is continuing all through this history, Ellen White says, and it's going to be joined by the fourth. But the fourth is the second angel. So we know that the second angel arrives here, but we know at 9/11 is when the second angel arrived. So we know that's true. But we also have the first angel being empowered. Now, the first angel's message is actually given over here for this line. So this first angel here, and this empowering of this first angel, is similar to this history here. Even though this is a reform line, this reform line is a reform line that's connected to this reform line. We're repeating Millerite history. Now we're repeating, it's the effect of every vision. Our history is much more complete. But this is our primary template that we use. And yet, when we look at our line, we see the second angel and the first angel are separate in this line, but they're together in our line. But that's because this is about the fourth angel, which is about the second angel. This is about this history here, the midnight cry message. It's it's not about fear God, give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment has come, because judgment already began here. Now we know judgment, of course, is going to end here. But the first angel's message is primarily addressed in this history, and this history is primarily about the second angel's message, if that makes sense, as far as its repeat. Because when we start to look at our history of what we have here, we're much more focused on this period in 1844 in our reform line than we are on this other part. Now, initially, we spent a lot of time on this, and this is not unimportant. But when we look at our reform line, we have a reform line within the reform line. Now, I'm going to do this part of it on Sundays because I'm going to address Samuel Snow's letters. And I think that's one of the keys that we have in understanding our history. Because when we look at our movement is not the reform line of the 144,000. That is, our movement is Samuel Snow. It's Ezekiel. It's a fractal or wheel within this larger reform line. This whole reform line here is the reform line that Ellen White addresses. She doesn't address our reform line, not in any kind of direct way. And she's looking at this history. She sees the three angels' message arrive here, and she sees it joined by a fourth. And that fourth is really this one, the second. It's just a repeat of the second angel's message. But of course, you have to have the first angel's message repeat if you're going to have the second angel's message repeat. Now, there was a bunch of, I don't like using the word nonsense, but to me it was nonsense because it didn't make any sense. We kept trying to place the first and second angel's messages in our history. And we would have like the first, second, and third angel's messages are all here. And this doesn't even make any sense to me because the third angel's message is already in our history. What we have to do is we have to prepare for that third angel's message. And so we have this reform line with the first and second angel that's going to help us receive the third angel's message. And the third angel's message, which arrived here on October 22nd, 1844, it doesn't arrive in our history. It's already there. It will complete its work here at the close of probation. That's when the third angel's message will be complete. And you can see that the third angel's message, we haven't read it yet. The third angel's message is about that close of probation. And so we're going to look at it right now. So try to see if we can see what I'm talking about, that I'm not off track here. So when we look at the third angel's message, it's a little bit longer than, and then we're going to look at the fourth angel's message. And the third angel followed him, saying with a loud voice, if any man worship the beast and his image, and receive his mark on his right hand or his forehead, the same shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out without mixture into the cup of his indignation. And he shall be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment ascendeth up forever and ever, and they have no rest day nor night, who worship the beast in his image, and whosoever receiveth the mark of his name. Here is the patience of the saints. Here are they that keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. So when we look at this third angel's message, which we're all familiar with, we know that it's about the Sunday law test. But it's not just about the Sunday law test. It's about the judgments of God being poured out. If we were to say, for instance, that the third angel arrived in 9/11, this would make no sense. There's no Sunday law in 9/11. There's no judgment of God being poured out. This is talking about the end of sin. And this is talking about a people, the 144,000, who now stand there and they keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus in the most trying circumstances. They're going to go through the time of Jacob's trouble. Ellen White says that most events, when we anticipate them, they're not as bad. I'm kind of paraphrasing. They're not as bad as we anticipate. But she says with the time of Jacob's trouble, It's worse than anything we can anticipate. So there's an experience that the 144,000 go through that no other person, no other group of people have ever gone through. Other people have gone through it. Christ went through it. He tasted of the second death. They're going to have that experience of Christ. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? They're going to feel totally abandoned and cut off from their God, and yet they're still going to remain faithful. They're going to manifest the patience, the perseverance, and the character of Christ. So when we look at the third angel's message, I don't see that we can add it here until the close of probation, because this is the group of people who are then, we could start it at the Sunday law, but it's all about the Sunday law leading to that close of probation, the Sunday Sabbath test. And it's going to then deal with the pouring out of the plagues and ultimately the destruction of the wicked, right? And that happens. So it's covering a large period of time, but it definitely doesn't start at 9/11. You know, that's my argument. And I've seen it drawn there, and I never understood it, because it's like we don't understand what the third angel's message is about. So now let's look at the Revelation 18. So we know the third angel's message. Now, when I say that, the third angel's message arrived here. So somebody would argue, well, you have the third angel's message arriving here, and you're under the proclamation of the third angel's message. So I just contradicted myself if you weren't listening. But what I'm saying is the message arrives here. And in our history, when we see this message again, we're seeing at its completion. But we know the Sunday law doesn't even arrive on October 22nd, 1844. But this is the development of this message. Now, we can often say the third angel's message is righteousness by faith and verity, right? So I'm just going to, before I go this here, I'm going to show you the screen. So we know the third angel's message arrived here because we're under the proclamation of the third. And under the proclamation of the third, God is going to develop the understanding of the Sabbath and the understanding of the investigative judgment. And we're under this proclamation of this message, but we don't understand the message. We're under the proclamation of it. We're Seventh-day Adventists. We preach the three angels' messages. That's what our church is about. And we know it has something to do with the Sunday law. But we don't comprehend it completely because we're going to go into darkness. And we're going to do that as we go to the fourth generation. We're finally in darkness here. In 1989, we're in the fourth generation. And God's going to bring a reform line. And, you know, Ellen White makes statements like the Sabbath is going to be proclaimed more fully, which I think is not just that, you know, we're doing more preaching about the Sabbath, we're going to understand it. And this message of 1888 was meant to help us understand the Sabbath because we needed to understand righteousness by faith, that the Sabbath was not about not working on a day. It was about reflecting the character of Christ. And Jones and Wagner present this message, but it doesn't do its work because the first and second angel's messages have been rejected. And so the hearts are not receptive, and they're not receptive because another work had to happen first. Now that work is the work of the first and second angel. So in our history, in order for the third angel's message to have any effect, so when it arrives here, in 1844 in a very weak way. It arrives. We're in the proclamation of the third angel's message. But that angel has not done its work because the first and second angels have been rejected. First and second messages. When we get here, these messages are again introduced. And they're prophetic messages, and they address all of the issues that had been neglected or misunderstood in the early history. So Ellen White may have understood them, but we as a people didn't understand them. But also, something is happening. When something's happening with the church, something is also going to happen with the world. We know in this part, the only horn that fell was Protestantism. But now, republicanism is going to fall in our history. And we know here that when Protestantism fell, it's now part of Babylon. But when we get here to 9/11, when we get here to our history, in 9/11, when the fourth angel joins, we're going to look at that history, and now we can maybe understand what our role is and what it is we're doing, and why the second horn is going to fall, why republicanism falls. It falls because of the action of the church, because of God's people. God's people get it. So they understand something, and it affects a change in them. It affects a change in God's people that allows that third angel to finally accomplish its work. And it's going to judge, it's the judgment of two groups of people. So let's take a look at Revelation chapter 18. I think that might make what I did might have made it make more sense. I'm hoping what I said there helps. So when we get to Revelation 18, so after these things I saw another angel come down from heaven, having great power, and the earth was lightened with his glory. And he cried mightily with a strong voice, saying, Babylon the Great is fallen, and is become the habitation of devils, and the hold of every foul spirit, and a cage of every unclean and hateful bird. For all nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication, and the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth are waxed rich through the abundance of her delicacies. And I heard another voice from heaven saying, Come out of her, my people, that ye be not partakers of her sins, and that ye receive not of her plagues. For her sins have reached unto heaven, and God hath remembered her iniquities. Reward her even as she rewarded you, and double unto her double, according to her works. In the cup which she hath filled to her double. And we could keep on reading this here, but when we look at this Revelation 18, we see a difference. We know that in Revelation 14, when you're talking about the second angel's message, it's simply Babylon is fallen. There is actually not a call to come out of Babylon in Revelation 14. Now, Ellen White says, and I probably should have these statements here, but she says here in 1844 that there was a partial fall when the Protestant churches rejected the Adventist message that Jesus was coming back, and they became part of Babylon, the Protestants, that this is a partial fall. So it's a moral fall. But here, the sins of Babylon, the Christian churches, more and more errors will develop. So we know that it's progressive. Even though the fall starts here of Protestantism, it doesn't really receive its total fruit of that fall, its total manifestation, until we get to this history. So Christians here, they still knew the Bible. They would still know quite a bit about the Old Testament. My grandfather, who was a minister, in his book collection, which I gave to my nephew, he had, books on the sanctuary, lots of Old Testament studies. He studied the Hebrew people. He definitely enjoyed the Old Testament. But Christians here have no knowledge of the Old Testament, hardly any knowledge of the New Testament. And the Bible is just kind of it's a decorative thing. It doesn't really mean anything. They don't preach from it. They don't understand it. It has more a mystical effect than any sort of, it's more like a charm rather than God's word. So Christians, they might read it, but they read it in a devotional sense. What kind of lessons can I learn about life, about how to have a good marriage and things like that. They might look at it a bit as a moral book. It teaches some things about morals, but they look at it very subjectively, and they interpret it with a methodology that allows them to make the Bible say pretty much whatever they want it to say, because they don't accept it as God's inspired word. So you can see that Protestantism here had a moral fall, but it's manifested. And so Ellen White says here that in this time, there's going to be this call to come out of Babylon, because all Babylon really has fallen to the point that it's corrupt. And you can see that in Revelation chapter 8. It's the cage of every foul and unclean and hateful bird, right? It's disgusting. Christianity has become disgusting. And So here, when there's a call to come out of Babylon, this call comes also in a time when the second horn is going to fall. And that's because Protestantism, once you lose the power of the gospel, you then seek the power of the state. And that's what Christianity has been doing. If you look at the Christian right, if you look at Christians in general, they see the problems that exist in society. They see, homosexuality, transgenderism, abortion, all this immorality that's going on, and they want it stopped. Now, the gospel is the message that we've been given to correct sin, to transform our character. But Christianity doesn't have the gospel anymore. And so what they're seeking is the power of the state to control. And so we see with Trump, he's controlled by evangelicals, and his personal goals are really not the issue. It's the goals of the people that he's trying to satisfy, the voters. They want to see America great again. They want it to go back to the way it was. But they are not about seeing their heart change. It's not their focus. Their focus is not on their personal lives and how they can change. Even though there's some good Christians who do live a good Christian life, their focus is on the sins of the nation, the sins of others. And their own sins, they can readily excuse. So they seek now the power of the state. And so the state is going to solve the problem of sin. And that's the way many Christians look at it. And they may not see fully what they're doing. They may not really understand that the failure of the reason why America is immoral, the moral failure of America, is the result of the Christian church itself. They have failed. It's not that the state has somehow, or the liberals have somehow taken over the schools and the churches and the government and the media that sin exists in the United States. It's because the people themselves have not been living the gospel. They've not been living a Christian life. And so they see all this sin around them, they see all this corruption, and yet they participate in it, maybe in a more subtle way than they realize, with all their sporting events and their entertainment that they watch and the movies that they support. And if Christians actually just lived a moral life, there's lots of them in the United States. The United States would be a completely different place. But they've lost the power of the gospel. They lost the power to change themselves. They can see that they want to do right, but they don't have the power to do right. They can see what's wrong, but they don't have the power to change themselves. And they don't have the power to change others, and yet they seek the power of the state to do that. If you just have laws and you bring prayer back to the schools and all these different things that they think that if we did them, we would go back to the way we were, the way we imagined we were, which was a godly Christian nation. So when we get to this history then, our history, we can see that this second angel's message is about the second horn that's going to fall. Republicanism is now going to fall. And it's because of Protestantism. Protestantism has failed. And when Protestantism fails, republicanism fails. In order to have, as I said earlier, to have a republican government, you need righteous people. You need people that are going to be upstanding and honorable and honest and law-abiding. A republic cannot stand if the people themselves are corrupt. And so this is why the horn falls here. It falls because Protestantism has fallen. But it took a long time to get to the point where now Protestants will persecute other Christians who aren't keeping their Sunday, who are keeping the Sabbath. And they think this is all about morality. In their minds, it's about, transgenderism and all these different evils that exist, but yet they're going to persecute God-fearing Christians over the Sabbath Sunday issue. So we know that the republicanism falls with the Sunday law. Now, it's a bit more complicated because we have the image of the beast that's going to be formed, and that's going to be attested to the people of God. And then there's the mark of the beast. the actual Sunday law. And we know the Sunday law is progressive, just doesn't happen in one day. So, but the United States, when they make a law that ignores the freedom of conscience, that enforces upon the people the papal Sabbath, that then they have formed an image to the beast. And then they're going to enact that in the Sunday law. So I'm just trying to see how much time I have here. So I know I don't have a great deal of time. Yeah, so I got a bit of time. So now we're going to look at this fourth angel arrives. It's the second angel, right? And it arrives at 9/11. Now it's going to swell to a loud cry, and it's going to join the third angel. So we know the third angel is about those people that do not receive the mark of the beast. It's about those people who keep the commandments of God and have the faith of Jesus. And it's also about the people, the judgment that's going to come upon the people who are then trying to enforce the mark of the beast, and the people who receive the mark of the beast. So you're going to have that judgment upon them. Now, I'm saying that this is the joining of the two sticks. So I've done a lot of things to sort of preface this point, and hopefully the point makes sense to people. And I could develop this reform line a bit further. And I'm going to have to do some of that in my other studies, especially as we look at Samuel Snow's letters. I think we'll be able to understand it better. But here's a way that we can look at it. We can say that this refers to Protestants, and this is Millerites. So in this history, we have the group that is the Protestants. They fail under the first angel's message. But the ones who don't fail, the Millerites, they continue, and they come to the time October 22nd, 1844. And then God develops the Seventh-day Adventists. So we got these Seventh-day Adventists who develop from the Millerites, and we're Seventh-day Adventists. So now we come to this history, and we're going to have another reform line. Now, we've looked at this reform line in different ways. We know we have SDAs here, right, if we wanted to look at it that way. And then we're going to have the world here. Maybe this isn't quite the right way to do it, because I should have the Sunday law in here. But just in a simple sense, this message first goes to Seventh-day Adventists, and then the message goes to the world, right? Because God's people have to be reformed. Here, the Protestants first get this message, but now the Millerites get this message. And when you look at this, this line, this was developed years ago. Jeff dealt with this a lot more. This, first the church, then the world, and also this separation of Protestants and Millerites. Now, one of the things that he was looking at, and I don't know if everybody's familiar with it, but the Millerites had what they called the midnight cry. And the midnight cry, they believed that they were giving the midnight cry from 1840 to the end of the Jewish year 1843. And then Samuel Snow comes along and he says that we're going to give the true midnight cry. So they believed that they were giving a message early on that was the midnight cry, but it wasn't the midnight cry. And Elder Jeff had put this up on our line where we could, where at least I could see it, is that we have, I'm going to get rid of this. I'm going to try to draw this here. So we know we have close of probation. We have the loud cry here. We have the Sunday law here. We have 9/11 here, just for lack of anything else, and 1989 here. So we have this line here, 1989, 9/11, the Sunday law, the close of probation. And we'd have the loud cry here between the Sunday law and the close of probation. But we came to realize that we had some waymarks between 9/11 and the Sunday law, and we call them midnight and the midnight cry. So these two waymarks here, this is Millerite history. But the group that's repeating Millerite history is not this entire line of the 144,000. This is a group within Adventism. So if we're going to take this idea here, this is the church, and this is going to be the world. The loud cry is given to the world. The midnight cry parallels the loud cry, and we can lay this over top of it. We can take this line here, and we can lay Millerite history over this whole line. We can make this October 22nd. We can make this July 21st. You know, we can make this April 19th. You know, we can make this 1798. You know, we can lay the line in different ways. So I've seen people do it all different kinds of ways to try to illustrate it, because we have this big line. And this big line, Millerite history definitely typifies this big line. But really, Millerite history is this big line, if you really want to think about it. This is the time of the end. The first angel arrives. The second angel arrives here. The third angel arrives here. And then finally, the fourth angel arrives, which is a repeat of the second. It is a repeat of history, because the first angel has to arrive again. You have to have a time of the end. But this is still, the third angel is continued all the way through here. But now we have this reform line within this reform line, which is this movement, and the Levites. That is, it's the church. And we divide this, and if you wanted to do it another way, you could say priests and Levites. I could sort of divide them, though our lines overlap. And you could say the priests began in 1989. The Levites at 9/11, you know, that's their time of the end. There's lots of different ways we've done it. And I'm not sure that I know the right way to write it out so that it's clear and simple. But what I can say is that this movement now that we have, if we wanted to divide this here, we could divide this as priests and Levites in this way. We know that in order for the Levites to be ready for the Sunday law, we had to have first another group of people within Adventism, and then the Levites would come. Now, again, I'm talking about the joining of the two sticks. The priests and Levites are not the two sticks. The two sticks are Protestants and Seventh-day Adventists. That is, it's Judah, which is Seventh-day Adventists, and Israel, which are the Protestants. The Protestants had a fall here, a moral fall. They had their opportunity. They failed. And now we come again to a repeat of the first and second angel's messages. The Protestants once again have an opportunity. Now they're not going to form God's denominated people. They're going to join with God's denominated people. And so what I see here is this arrival of the third angel's message and the fourth angel joining it is also the joining of the two sticks. And it's not because the third angel is one stick and the fourth angel is another stick. It just happens because of the message that's given. Of course, the group of Protestants here, these Protestants that failed, are not the same group of people here. There's many Protestants throughout this history who are seeking to follow God. And we can see this on the internet. You'll find Protestants who recognize the Catholic Church is the Babylon. You know, it's the papacy is evil. They will even recognize, you know, the attack that's being done on God's word. They'll have messages that are very close to ours. Now, some of these groups even keep the Sabbath, but many of them don't, even though they see all the errors that have come in from Catholicism, and they're really, truly Protestants. They don't see the Sabbath yet. When we get into this history and we start giving the midnight and the midnight cry, we are presenting the Sabbath and the sanctuary to Protestants. And those individuals will then join with us. And that's going to be the joining of the two sticks. You know, if you want to try to go back to the story of Judah and Joseph, which we started, you know, in our studies, So when you look at Judah, he's the one who sells Joseph into slavery. So obviously Judah here doesn't represent the good people, but he does still symbolize one of the sticks. And Joseph is the one that he sells. Joseph, of course, his son Ephraim becomes the largest tribe and represents northern Israel. And actually, in a sense, if you look at the whole story of Joseph, everything's reversed, because Pharaoh is a good guy in the story of Joseph. So you can't take how they symbolize later on. You can't take those symbols and then say, well, Judah's good and Joseph is bad, right? Obviously not, because Joseph is a type of Christ. But you can take that illustration, that joining of the two sticks, and you can see that in order for Judah and his brothers to join once again with Joseph, there's a reform line. And I haven't addressed that reform line in detail because I don't know how to do it. But I do know that we can take that reform line and we can see the parallel. What happens with Joseph is a parallel to our reform line. It's a parallel to the reform line of Christ as well. And we have done it in the past, but we have more waymarks. And if I was going to put midnight, I would put midnight when Joseph is 30 and he stands before Pharaoh. And I would put the prediction before midnight is when he's 28 and he interprets the dreams of the butler and baker. And that's where I would put midnight in the midnight cry. And then I would put the Sunday law probably at the beginning of the famine. But, there's different ways that people might look at that. My point is that separation and in joining, we have Judah who separates from his brother. Judah and his brothers, they fail. If we want to put them as a parallel, they would be the Protestants. And Joseph, he goes on to fulfill God's prophecy, but he's going to join with his brothers. And that's really what that story is about, it's about the transformation. One is it happens to Joseph. So maybe he has a bit arrogant attitude because he's treated special, a bit spoiled. When he's sold into slavery, he resolves to follow his God. But his brothers, they sell him into slavery, and they now go through their own experience. They see the hurt that they caused their father, and so they are changed men when Joseph sees them 22 years later. The other thing that we then see is the same thing has to happen in all of the other reform lines. There's a reform line is about a conversion, and it's about it's not all of them have a joining of the two sticks, so to say, but they do have a resolution that happens. Now, when we come to the two sticks, we know that we started with 723 BC with Israel being scattered, never to be gathered, but in 1798 they are gathered, just not literal Israel. The Protestant church takes that role. So it takes that role of false prophet. And then the Seventh-day Adventist Church in 1844, it is then gathered, and it's now going to take on the role of the southern kingdom, of Jerusalem, of Judah, God's denominated people. But Seventh-day Adventists are separate from Protestants. One is we get persecuted by Protestants for a long time, and then the church compromises. The church doesn't want to be rejected by Protestants, it wants to be accepted. And so by 1957, we get to the point where our church is basically in bed with the Protestants, with the evangelicals. We make all kinds compromises. We join in the World Council of Churches. Our ministers join the local ministerial associations, and those are joined with the assumption that you're not going to be stealing members from other people's churches. That's not your goal. Your goal is to get new converts only, and that's why you can work with these other pastors who are teaching all kinds of errors, but you're in this belief that you're trying to save people. So it waters down the message of Seventh-day Adventism. So now we're in this period where Seventh-day Adventists are going to go through a revival. And they're going to go back to the foundation. and they're going to give a message that's going to call people out of Babylon. And that Babylon is Protestantism, because Protestant and Catholicism to some degree, but I would think that primarily the joining of the two sticks is Protestants who join with Seventh-day Adventists. Now, there might be some Catholics who join. I'm not saying that they're not going to, but they're then going to give a message to the world. And this view of mine is different from a lot of others. Some people may find it strange and they may not agree with it, but this is the view I've held for a long time. In that the message here that primarily goes to the world is going to go to atheists, to Hindus, to Buddhists, to Catholics, to all kinds of people who are spiritualistic. But people who, in their false religious beliefs, are still trying to seek God in some way. And they will make a choice and a decision to stand and become martyrs over the Sunday Sabbath issue, because they'll see it for what it is. And I'm not sure how many people, or what kind of people, or what kind of way in which they're going to, because everyone's an individual. But this is what I see, is that people are going to join, and Protestants and Adventists are going to be giving this message. The priests, the Levites, and the Nethinims are going to be giving this message to the world. We have taught that Nethinims represent the world, and I don't agree with that. And the reason I don't agree with it is because Nethinims are attached to the sanctuary, but they're not Jews. They would parallel the Protestants. They wouldn't parallel the world. And Edom, Moab, and Ammon, which are those that escaped from the hand of the papacy and from the hand of spiritualism, those again are not Nethinims. Those are people that are in all kinds of false worship. So that's my view. You know, whether it's right or wrong, I don't know. But that's the way that I understand it. Yes, Kelly, you have a point? Or not? I just saw your name flash up on the screen. So to me, the joining of the two sticks, I wrote an email to Jeff one time, because this was back, I think, in 2014. Could have been 2015. But I wrote an email to him because he was talking about the joining of the two sticks. And he was also talking about the image of the beast test. And I asked him, when are the two sticks joined? And he said, at the image of the beast. And that has always stuck with me, and I've tried to understand what he's talking about. Maybe I completely misunderstood him. But I look at the image of the beast test that precedes the Sunday law is when Protestants will recognize what is happening and will make a stand with Seventh-day Adventists at the Sunday law. Now, my view is the 144,000, which we were talking a bit during the break, is the 144,000 represents Seventh-day Adventists. They don't represent Protestants who join with us. They represent Seventh-day Adventists, people who have studied the Bible in the spirit of prophecy, who understand these truths, have been keeping the Sabbath and health reform, following God for years and years, and have now come and stood and passed the Sunday law test. That others join with us and receive that blessing doesn't make them one of the 144,000. Now, again, that might be a controversial view, because other people might look at it differently. They'd say anybody who received the seal of God should be one of the 144,000. But the 144,000 of the 12 tribes of Israel, and they are virgins. So they don't have a false religious belief. They have a correct belief. Just because Protestants stand with us at the Sunday law, they may not fully understand everything that we believe. That may not be the test for them. And they may still disagree with some of our views, but they're going to still stand that test. And that's the way that makes the most sense to me. So a lot of this is a little bit, it's a little bit of reasoning, and reasoning can be good if it's sanctified reasoning. But I don't think it disagrees with anything that the Bible or the spirit of prophecy says. But it might disagree, people might disagree with it still because they have different ideas on how to understand these things. Now, my original plan in the joining of the two sticks, because when I wrote the paper, if you read through the paper, I deal with the reform lines a little bit. But I don't really go all the way here in drawing this out. And that's because at the time, and I still even now, I'm not sure we fully understand our reform line, because we've been focusing upon the line of the priests and the Levites. And we had some false ideas come in about the line of the 144,000 and the line of the Nethinim, which I'm not sure I would even have a line of the Nethinim, personally. So, there are some differences there. I just don't understand. I've never understood the line of the Nethinim. It never made sense to me. Priests and Levites have a line, because when we look at each of these histories, we have Protestants and Millerites, right? We don't have a third group. Now, we do in a sense, because within the Millerites are divided a little bit, because you have Samuel Snow, who is typical of something, which I think he's typical of the priests, just like Ezekiel is typical of the priests, which is this movement. So Samuel Snow typifies this movement particularly. He is a Millerite, but he's a movement within the Millerites, a movement mostly of one man and a few other people who support him, which then gives a message to the Millerites, and the Millerites accept that message. So when we look at our history and we look at priests and Levites are both Seventh-day Adventists. You have the church and the world. But you don't have three groups within Millerite history that are Millerites. You have, and you don't have in the Protestants either. So when I look at this movement, the priests and the Levites are the church, but there isn't a third group there. We don't have priests, Levites, and Nethinims represented in anywhere that I can see. Now, I realize that's not what people understand. So I could be wrong. I'm not saying I'm right and everybody else is wrong. Just telling you how I understand it. That these priests and Levites are the church, and we parallel Snow and Ezekiel, and the Levites parallel in Millerite history, that would be the Millerites. In Ezekiel, that would be the people that he's preaching to, that he's giving the message to, which would be Judah. So the Jews, right? So that's my ideas. I know that there may be some differences that people have, and probably I am wrong about a few things, because usually I am. But are there any questions about what I've said that somebody would like to address? And if not, we can close with prayer and then say our goodbyes after that.
I had a nice one to add, Theodore, to much earlier when you had mentioned about the 666 and the Vicar of Christ. So the thought that it is if you've got the Vicar Filii Dei, so Vicar representative, Dei, God, and Filii, Son. And most of you probably already know this, but it's worth repeating. But then there's a nice parallel to that in the line of Christ, between Christ and Barabbas. Mm-hmm. So if you break down the name of Barabbas, you've got Abba for father and Bar, son. So you've got that son of the father, right? So that's a false god that they choose there, right in the line of Christ with Barabbas. So that kind of parallels with the vicar. So I just thought if that makes sense, and
yeah, I mean,
to add that.
Tons of parallels between the true and the false, the counterfeit,
sure.
and the genuine. I mean, you could they doing that. Yeah, thanks. Now,
cool.
And Angela has a comment. I agree. Isaiah 56 and Mark 6:15 and John 10:16. Although there are even many in Adventism, including myself, who are not nearly as well educated in the history of the church as we wish we were, etc., not very well educated in many of Ellen G. White's writings, but have a willingness to learn and apply them. So yeah, so we see what she's talking about is that we see that there's many people who are not of this fold, but they're still God's people, and that God will bring those people in. So, and that's the thing is, you know, I was a Protestant before I was a Seventh-day Adventist, and you know, most of my friends, people I knew, were Christians from other denominations, and really I've never been a lot of friends with a lot of Adventists, some, I'm friends with Kelly. But, I just I'm not one as I'm not a social person. But the other thing is I've always tried to spend time with people with other beliefs, not to take in their beliefs, but to have contact with people and not just to isolate myself as a Seventh-day Adventist. And so I've done jobs going door to door selling scripture songs for years, running a guitar store, and ministering to people who are from other denominations, having contact with them, and finding that there are people seeking truth. But I never had a burden to bring them into Adventism, because I didn't believe that my church was, that they're ready for the church. The church isn't ready for them. There's something still missing. And I think that when we have this joining of the two sticks, the Adventist church will be ready to receive that harvest that, we've talked about. The church is not ready to receive people because they search sea and land and find one proselyte, make it twofold a child of hell that they themselves are. So that's what my experience in Adventism. I've seen so many people destroyed by becoming Adventists rather than actually becoming Christians. So anyway, let's close with
I have a question. Is it possible that the priests and Levites being joined together can be like the two sticks in a fractal sense?
Well, I think in a fractal sense, yeah. I think you can look at that. But I still think the two sticks ultimately is not referring to priests and Levites. It is referring to Protestants and Adventists. And especially when you look in the context of a Republican horn falling at that time. And then it's at that point that many of the Protestants will see what's happening and recognize that this is not something that's Christ-like, and will stand with Seventh-day Adventists at the Sunday law. Even if they don't fully understand Adventism, they will see that they'll see what the truth is. They'll see what's really happening because they're true Christians, right? They're people who care and love for others, and they cannot see Christianity persecuting Christians in that way. And so it's about character in that context. But yeah, I would say that there's some ways in which in a fractal sense you can see that the priests and Levites, Seventh-day Adventists joining with us could be seen that way. But I don't think that's the primary way that I would look at it. Okay, well, thanks for that. And let's close with prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we are thankful for the time that we've had here. Even though I've rambled on a bit and probably things are not 100% clear to everyone, and I should have had more spirit of prophecy statements to support some of the things that I've said. But I know, Lord, that you can lead us as we individually check these things out, and that we can all be corrected, or I can be corrected in errors that I have. But I think, Lord, that the way that you've been leading this movement is the right way. You've allowed error to come in because we need to be corrected, and we need to see the fruit of what error is. And I pray, Lord, that we can see that in our own lives most of all. It helps us not at all to see the sins in others. Help us, Lord, to see the sins and errors in ourselves. Forgive us for our sins. Help us to live a godly life and to reflect Christ's character in all that we do. And we know, Lord, that if we do this, that we will be able to stand with your people in the Sunday law test, and we will be able to give that message to the world. So we ask that you can do this work in our lives. Help us to be loving and kind to one another, and we pray for unity amongst your people. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
I'm just going to stop the recording here.